Picture this. Your own home. The house you and your wife built together over 30 years of marriage. And there she is, on her knees on the kitchen tiles, scrubbing until her hands shake and her back aches, sweat on her forehead. And across the room, sprawled across the sofa with his feet up on the coffee table, a grown man is shouting at his phone screen. This steak isn't medium rare. Go and cook it again. This wasn't a hotel. This was our home. And that man was my own son-in-law, a man who thought that marrying into our family gave him the right to treat my wife like hired help. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly how I finally found the courage to speak up for my wife, how we quietly built our case, and how one ordinary Tuesday morning I walked up to that ungrateful young man and handed him a single sheet of paper. On it were 3 words, notice to quit. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own house, this story is for you. Let's get into it. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent my whole life as an ordinary, hardworking man. I left school at 16, took an apprenticeship, spent 32 years doing the same trade, and never once complained about the long hours because I knew what I was working towards, a roof over my family's head and a bit of peace at the end of the day. I've got a modest semi-detached house in a quiet part of town, a small garden I'm proud of, a shed I potter about in on Sunday afternoons, and a wife, Margaret, who has stood beside me through every hard winter we've faced, redundancies, a leaking roof one particularly miserable January, the year her mother was ill and we drove back and forth to the hospital every single evening after work. We raised one daughter, Claire, and we like to think we raised her well. She was never a difficult child. She did her homework without being asked twice, she was kind to her teachers, and she grew into a thoughtful, warm young woman who we were, and still are, incredibly proud of. So when she came home one Sunday for lunch, practically glowing, to tell us she'd met someone, we were happy for her. Genuinely happy. 2 years ago, Claire got married. Her husband, Daniel, seemed pleasant enough at first, polite at dinners, well-spoken, the sort of young man you'd be happy to introduce to your friends down the pub. He'd compliment Margaret's cooking, ask me about the football, offer to help carry the shopping in from the car. On paper, he ticked every box a father could ask for. But you only really learn a person's character once you give them comfort without asking anything in return. Character isn't what someone shows you when they're trying to impress you. It's what they do when they think no one's counting anymore. About 6 months into the marriage, Claire and Daniel came to us and explained that Daniel had lost his job, some restructuring at the firm he worked for, nothing he could have prevented, or so we were told, and that money was tight. They asked if they could stay with us for just a couple of months, until we're back on our feet. A couple of months. I still remember those words. They ring in my ears now like some kind of cruel joke. We said yes, of course. She's our daughter. Her home is our home. We cleared out the box room, brought the old double bed down from the loft, and Margaret spent an entire weekend making the room feel welcoming, new curtains, fresh linen, a little vase of flowers on the windowsill. We didn't think twice about it. What we didn't know was that a couple of months was really the beginning of an indefinite holiday, funded entirely by our savings and paid for, quite literally, in my wife's sweat. At first, things seemed fine. Daniel helped with the washing up, popped to the shops now and then, even offered to mow the lawn one Saturday, though he gave up halfway through and left me to finish it. But slowly, like water wearing down stone, his attitude began to shift. It happened so gradually that neither of us could point to a single day and say, that's when it changed. It was more like a tide going out, you don't notice the sea receding until suddenly the boats are sitting on dry sand. And the one who bore the weight of that shift, day in and day out, was Margaret, who found herself running the entire household from morning until night, cooking 3 meals a day for 4 adults, doing 3 loads of washing a week instead of 1, and somehow still finding time to do her part-time job at the local surgery 3 mornings a week. Looking back now, our biggest mistake was letting our silence become his habit. Every time he asked for a little more than he should, we'd tell ourselves, it's fine, it's for our daughter's sake, and let it go. But every time we stayed quiet, his confidence grew, and Margaret's strength wore thinner. I think, if I'm honest with myself, part of me kept hoping that if we simply didn't make a fuss, things would naturally correct themselves. That he'd wake up one morning and think, this isn't fair on them, is it? That never happened. Not once. What started as an inconvenience quickly became a routine, and it was a routine that only benefited one person in that house. Every week, Daniel would hand Margaret a shopping list as long as your arm: organic free-range eggs, a specific imported brie he'd developed a taste for, cold-pressed olive oil from a particular Italian brand, sourdough from a bakery 2 towns over because the supermarket loaf wasn't the same, and every so often some obscure, gourmet ingredient that wasn't stocked anywhere within 20 miles of our village. Margaret would spend hours driving between supermarkets trying to fulfill his requests, coming home exhausted with bags of shopping that cost more than our own weekly food bill used to be for the two of us. I remember one Saturday in particular. Margaret had been to 3 different shops looking for a specific brand of balsamic vinegar he'd asked for, and when she finally found it and brought it home, tired and pleased with herself for managing it, Daniel took one look at the label, wrinkled his nose, and said, "Oh, not this one, I meant the aged one, this is basically supermarket own brand." She didn't say a word. She just nodded and put it in the cupboard, where it sat, unused, for the rest of the time he lived with us. It wasn't just the shopping, either. Our next-door neighbor, Susan, mentioned to Margaret one afternoon over the garden fence that she'd seen a food delivery driver turning up at our house 2 or 3 evenings a week, sometimes as late as 11 o'clock. Margaret hadn't ordered anything. When she asked Daniel about it, he shrugged and said he'd just fancied a curry, and had put it on a card, though whose card exactly, he never quite explained. We started noticing small charges appearing on a joint account we'd once used purely for household bills, an account Daniel had somehow ended up with the login details for, after helping set up a shared shopping app early on. Nothing enormous, nothing that would have looked suspicious to a stranger glancing at a bank statement. Just £5 here, £12 there, a subscription to some online gaming service, a delivery charge on a Sunday night. Small enough that we almost didn't notice. Small enough, I suspect, that he knew we almost wouldn't. But when it came time to talk about contributing to the mortgage, the council tax, or even just the weekly food bill, there was always a new excuse waiting. Still job hunting. Got an interview lined up. Recruiter says the market's tough at the moment. 2 years passed, and that interview never seemed to materialize. I never once saw him send off a CV in front of us, never once heard him mention a company by name. When I gently asked how the job search was going, he'd get vague and a little irritable, and Claire would jump in to defend him. "It's a difficult market, Dad, you don't understand what it's like out there for young people now." Maybe she was right that the market was difficult. But a difficult market doesn't explain late-night gaming sessions that stretched into the early hours, followed by a long lie-in until noon, and then, once he finally surfaced, a shout down the stairs, "Where's breakfast? And bring it up, I can't be bothered coming down." Some mornings it wasn't even a shout. It was simply an assumption, unspoken but understood, that a tray would appear at his bedside whether he asked for it or not. Margaret, a woman who would never dream of asking for so much as a cup of tea when she herself was unwell, would carry a tray up to him without a word of complaint. Toast, 2 eggs, a pot of tea, sometimes a bit of fruit if we had any in. She'd knock gently, set it down on the bedside table, and leave. I asked her once why she kept doing it, and she just said, quietly, "It's easier than the alternative." I didn't fully understand what she meant by that at the time. I do now. There were other things too, smaller things, that added up over time the way small stones eventually become a wall you can't see over. He'd leave his plates in the living room for days until Margaret cleared them. He'd run the shower for 20 minutes at a time, using up the hot water before either of us had a chance to wash. He once complained, quite seriously, that our internet wasn't fast enough for his gaming and suggested we look into upgrading the package, as though it were entirely reasonable to expect us to increase our own bills for his convenience. Whenever I tried to raise the subject, gently, at first, the way you'd approach any delicate family matter, I'd get the same answer every time: don't you two care about Claire at all? If you say another word to me, I'll take her and leave. That threat worked every single time. He used our love for our daughter as a shield, and we, terrified of anything driving a wedge into her marriage, terrified of losing time with her, of missing out on grandchildren one day, of becoming the difficult in-laws in the story she'd tell, went quiet. For the first month, we told ourselves this was just a rough patch, that things would settle down once he found work. But instead of settling, his demands only grew bolder, and the excuses grew thinner, until eventually he stopped bothering with excuses at all. He simply expected. And expectation, when it goes unchallenged for long enough, hardens into entitlement. There was a particular evening, around the 8-month mark, that I've never quite been able to shake from my memory. It was Margaret's birthday. I'd booked a table at the little Italian place she loves in town, nothing extravagant, just the two of us, the way we'd celebrated every birthday for the past decade. I came downstairs at 6 o'clock to find Margaret in the kitchen, not getting ready, but ironing one of Daniel's shirts, because he had something important on that evening and needed it done urgently. I asked her, gently, why she was doing it now, of all times, and she just said, "It'll only take a minute, love, we've still got time." It took considerably more than a minute. We arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes late, and I watched my wife apologize to the waiter for our lateness on her own birthday, for a delay that wasn't remotely her fault. I didn't say anything to Daniel about it when we got home. I wish, looking back, that I had. There was also the matter of the car. Margaret's little runabout, a car she'd saved up for and bought outright after years of driving my old banger to work, started coming back with the petrol gauge lower than she'd left it, on days she hadn't used it at all. When she mentioned it, lightly, almost apologetically, Daniel said he'd just borrowed it for a quick errand, without thinking to ask. It happened more than once. Each time, the apology was the same, brief, breezy, already halfway out of the room before it was finished. I want to be clear about something, because I've thought about this a great deal since it all happened. This wasn't really about a steak, or a bottle of wine, or a shopping list. Those were just symptoms. The real illness was a complete absence of respect, for Margaret's time, for her health, for the roof over his head that wasn't his to take for granted. And the longer it went unaddressed, the more entrenched it became, until it reached a point that neither of us could have predicted at the start. That Tuesday evening will stay with me for the rest of my life. Margaret had spent the entire day cleaning from top to bottom. Daniel had announced, the night before, almost as an afterthought over dinner, that some of his old university friends were coming round and the house needed to look presentable. Not asked. Announced. As though it were simply a fact of the household calendar, no different to the bins going out on a Thursday. She'd hoovered every room, washed the windows, scrubbed the bathroom until it gleamed, changed the bedding in the spare room in case anyone wanted to freshen up, and polished the kitchen floor until you could practically see your reflection in it. By early evening she was completely worn out, her feet swollen, her hands raw from the cleaning products, but the cooking still fell to her, as it always did, a proper spread, because Daniel had specifically requested something impressive for his friends. I watched her kneeling on the kitchen floor at around 6 o'clock, scrubbing at a stubborn stain by the back door that had been bothering him for days, her hands trembling and sweat running down her face despite the cool evening. She'd been on her feet, more or less continuously, since 7:30 that morning. And at that exact moment, Daniel, lounging on the sofa in the next room, glass of wine in hand, feet up on the arm-rest, glanced at the bottle on the table and called through, loud enough for the whole house to hear, "This isn't organic, is it? I only drink organic." Margaret didn't say a word. She simply got to her feet, one hand braced against the counter, and made her way towards the kitchen, and halfway there, without any warning at all, she swayed, reached out for something to steady herself, found nothing, and collapsed onto the floor. I can't fully put into words what I felt in that moment. Fear, anger, shame, all at once, crashing over me like a wave. I rushed to her side, my heart hammering, calling her name, and for a few agonizing seconds she didn't respond at all. She'd fainted from sheer exhaustion and lack of sleep, the doctor later told us, but in that moment, kneeling on our kitchen floor with my wife's head in my hands, I genuinely thought the worst. And Daniel? He didn't move from the sofa. Didn't even sit up properly. All he said, without so much as turning his head, was, "Call an ambulance if you need to, I was about to eat anyway." I will never, as long as I live, forget the sound of my own voice shouting his name in that moment, or the silence that followed, or the fact that he still didn't get up. We called an ambulance. The paramedics were kind, professional, quick. At the hospital, the doctors told us Margaret's body had simply given out under the strain, exhaustion, chronic sleep deprivation, dangerously low blood pressure, and mild dehydration, because in the rush of the day she hadn't even stopped to drink a glass of water. They kept her in overnight for observation. I sat beside her hospital bed until 2 in the morning, holding her hand while she slept, and something inside me broke in that corridor. Not loudly. Quietly. The way a support beam gives way after years of unseen strain, no crash, just a slow, final settling. When we got home the next day, exhausted and hollow, I placed a vacuum cleaner down in front of Daniel, who was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal as though nothing at all had happened, and said, "From now on, you're going to pull your weight in this house." His response? He laughed. Actually laughed, spoon still in hand, as though I'd told a joke over a pint at the pub. "That's not really my job," he said, shrugging, not even bothering to look up properly. "That's more of a woman's job, isn't it?" I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house I'd worked 30 years to pay for, and I genuinely didn't know whether to laugh or to throw him out there and then. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just laziness or carelessness. It was an entire mindset, one that hid a selfish, almost predatory dynamic behind the mask of our daughter's happiness. Our kindness, our patience, our years of biting our tongues, had become nothing more than something for him to exploit, quietly and comfortably, for as long as we let him. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I lay there beside Margaret, listening to her breathing, steadier now than it had been the day before, and I went over every single interaction we'd had with him for the past 2 years. The shopping lists. The threats. The tray carried up the stairs morning after morning. Margaret's birthday, spent ironing his shirt. The petrol gauge that never quite matched what she remembered. And by the time the sun came up, my mind was made up. I got up before dawn, made myself a cup of tea I barely touched, and sat at the kitchen table watching the sky lighten over the back garden. I thought about my own father, a quiet, patient man who rarely raised his voice about anything, and I remembered something he told me once, years before he passed: "Son, the measure of a man isn't how much he'll put up with. It's knowing exactly when to stop." I hadn't understood it properly at the time. Sitting at that table, with my wife upstairs recovering from a hospital visit that should never have been necessary, I understood it completely. From the next morning, I started keeping a record of everything. Every unreasonable demand, every argument, every moment he dismissed Margaret's exhaustion as though it meant nothing, I logged the date and time for each one in a small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. Some conversations I even recorded on my phone, quietly, propped up on the kitchen counter or tucked in my shirt pocket, just to have proof, should I ever need it. It felt strange, almost underhand, to be building a case against a member of my own family in my own home. But I told myself that documenting the truth isn't dishonest. Pretending it isn't happening, that's the real dishonesty. I booked a consultation with a solicitor in town, a sensible, no-nonsense woman who'd handled a similar situation for a client a few years back. She listened patiently as I explained everything: the arrangement, the lack of any tenancy agreement, the 2 years that had stretched far beyond the promised couple of months, Margaret's collapse. She explained that because Daniel had no formal tenancy agreement, no lease, and no legal right of residence beyond being a guest in our home, we were entitled, as the homeowners, to serve him with a formal notice to quit, provided we followed the correct legal process so there'd be no room for dispute later on. She was careful to walk me through it properly, the notice period required, the wording that needed to be precise and unambiguous, and what to do if you refused to leave once the notice period had expired. We had the notice drawn up properly, on solicitor's letterhead, so there could be no mistaking it for an idle threat born out of a bad week. Every word was chosen carefully, no accusations, no emotion, just plain, clear language. You are required to vacate this property within 28 days. I remember sitting at the kitchen table the evening before I gave it to him, turning the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of it far beyond the weight of the paper inside. Margaret sat across from me, quiet, her hand resting on mine. "Are you sure?" she asked, not because she disagreed, but because she knew, as I did, that there was no undoing what was about to happen. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything. The next morning, over breakfast, I placed the envelope down in front of him. He opened it, scanning the letter with a frown that slowly deepened as the meaning sank in. When I placed that letter in his hands, I watched the color drain from his face. Shock first, then a flush of anger rising up his neck, then that same old threat, delivered with rather less confidence than usual: "If you do this, I'm taking Claire and we're leaving." This time, my voice didn't waver. "Son," I said, "Claire is my daughter, the light of my life. But this house, this roof over our heads, that decision is mine to make, not yours. If you want to take her with you, that's between the two of you. But your right to live under this roof ends today." He tried a few different tactics after that. Anger, first, raised voice, a fist on the table, accusations that we'd never really accepted him into the family. Then, when that didn't move me, something closer to pleading, reminding me how much Claire loved him, how hurt she'd be, how we'd be tearing the family apart over a few misunderstandings. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I'd watched my wife collapse on our kitchen floor while he sat on the sofa asking about a bottle of wine, and that no amount of talk about misunderstandings was going to change what I'd seen with my own eyes. The hardest part, by far, was speaking to Claire. At first she was furious with us, in tears on our doorstep, convinced we were trying to destroy her marriage out of spite or, worse, that we simply didn't like Daniel and had never given him a fair chance. She accused me of being controlling, of never wanting her to be happy, of caring more about a clean kitchen than her feelings. Those words hurt more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal, because I knew they weren't true, but I understood why, from where she was standing, they might have felt true. I didn't argue with her that day. I simply asked her to sit down, and I showed her the recordings, the audio from that Tuesday evening, the sound of the bottle of wine being questioned, the sound of her own mother's collapse, and Daniel's voice afterwards, indifferent, almost bored, saying he was about to eat anyway. I watched her face change as she listened. I watched 2 years of small, dismissed comments suddenly rearrange themselves into a pattern she could finally see clearly. She confronted Daniel herself, alone, without either of us in the room, because I told her that part had to be hers to do, not ours. After 2 tense weeks of near silence between us, weeks where I genuinely wasn't sure whether our relationship with our own daughter would recover, she finally came round for tea one evening and told us that she'd come to see the truth of what had been happening under our roof, and that she and Daniel were now going their separate ways to figure things out, with the help of proper counseling, both individually and, eventually, perhaps together, though nothing was promised on that front. It was never my intention to end their marriage. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people watching this will assume that was the goal all along. My only intention was to reclaim our home, my wife's dignity, and the peace we'd lost somewhere along the way, without quite noticing it slipping through our fingers. But there's something I needed Claire, and everyone watching this, to understand clearly: loving your children does not mean tolerating disrespect from the person they've chosen to marry. Love, real love, sometimes means drawing a line even when it's painful, especially when it's painful, because the alternative is watching someone you love be worn down, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of the person they used to be. The 28 days passed, slower than I expected and somehow faster than I was ready for. Daniel packed his things over the course of a weekend, mostly in silence, occasionally muttering under his breath about how unfair we'd been. On the final morning, He walked out of our front door with 2 suitcases and an empty, resentful look on his face, glancing back at the house he'd lived in for 2 years without once, as far as I could recall, thanking either of us for the roof, the meals, or the patience we'd shown him. No thank you, no apology, but by that point, I no longer needed either from him. I'd stopped waiting for gratitude somewhere around the 18th month of that couple of months he'd promised us. The peace that settled over our home after that day is hard to put into words, even now, months later. Margaret's smile came back, the smile that had quietly disappeared over the past 2 years without either of us fully registering it was gone, the way you don't notice a light dimming until someone switches it fully back on and you realize how dark it had actually become. Her blood pressure returned to normal within a few weeks, according to her GP. She started sleeping properly again, a full uninterrupted night for the first time in longer than she could remember. And most importantly, that spark in her eyes finally returned, the spark I'd fallen in love with more than 30 years ago, the one I hadn't even realized I'd been missing until I saw it come back. These days, we sit out in the garden together in the evenings with a pot of tea, the roses Margaret planted last spring finally starting to bloom along the back fence, no longer bracing ourselves for a shout from the living room demanding to know where dinner is, no longer flinching at the sound of footsteps on the stairs. It's a small thing, sitting quietly together in your own garden. But after 2 years of tension, it felt, for the first few weeks, almost unbelievably luxurious. Claire visits us regularly now, on her own terms, and we've never once brought Daniel up unless she wants to talk about him herself. She's doing well, all things considered. She's moved into a small flat of her own, thrown herself back into her career, and started seeing a counselor privately, which I think has done her a world of good. We don't know yet what the future holds for her, whether she and Daniel will ever find their way back to each other in some healthier form, or whether this chapter of her life has closed for good. That part isn't ours to decide, and we've made peace with that. A few weeks ago, Claire came round on a Sunday afternoon and, quite unprompted, thanked us. Not for kicking Daniel out, not in those words, but for, finally saying something. She told us she'd spent the last few months replaying moments from her marriage she'd previously brushed past without a second thought, small comments, small dismissals, the way he'd talk over her at dinner parties, the way he'd once told her, half joking, that her job wasn't really a proper career. She said that seeing what he'd been willing to let her mother go through, without so much as getting up off the sofa, had been the thing that finally made those older, smaller moments make sense. I didn't say much in reply. I just held her hand across the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat alone at dawn making up my mind, and told her that whatever happened next, we'd support her through it. Margaret and I still talk about that period sometimes, usually on quiet evenings when the conversation drifts there naturally rather than being forced. She's told me, more than once, that the hardest part for her wasn't the exhaustion, or even the collapse itself. It was the quiet, creeping feeling that she'd somehow stopped mattering in her own home, that her comfort, her health, her simple right to sit down after a long day had become negotiable in a way it never used to be. Hearing her say that plainly, months after the fact, confirmed something I'd suspected all along: the damage done in situations like ours isn't only physical. It settles somewhere deeper, and it takes far longer to undo than 28 days. This whole experience taught me a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life: setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's one of the deepest forms of self-respect you can offer yourself and the people you love. Silence, I learned, isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's simply weakness in disguise, and people who are looking to take advantage, consciously or otherwise, will always recognize the difference between genuine patience and simple avoidance. They will always find the gap where you're too afraid to speak, and they will, without much hesitation, make themselves comfortable in it. If you find yourself in a similar situation, where "he's family now," or "she's my daughter's partner," or "we don't want to cause a fuss," is being used as an excuse to disrespect you or exploit your kindness, remember this: no relationship, no matter how close, no matter how much you love the people tangled up in it, gives anyone the right to turn you into a servant in your own home. Love asks for sacrifice, yes, and I'd make most of those sacrifices again without a second thought. But love should never, under any circumstances, ask for your dignity in return. The day you find yourself trading your own health, your own peace, your own sense of self-worth just to keep the peace with someone who gives nothing back, that is the day to start writing things down, the way I did, and to start asking yourself the harder questions I should have asked far sooner than I did. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've ever felt that quiet, growing weight of staying silent in your own home for far too long, watching someone you love wear themselves thin for someone who barely notices, let me know in the comments below with the words, "My boundary," so I know I'm not the only one who's walked this road, and so that others reading through the comments might find a little bit of courage in knowing they're not alone either. Please give this video a like, so that more true, heartfelt stories like this one can reach the people who need to hear them, the people who are perhaps sitting exactly where Margaret and I were 2 years ago, unsure whether they even have the right to say enough is enough. And if you'd like our next story to land in your notifications first, hit subscribe right now and tap that bell icon so you never miss one. I'll see you in the next story, and until then, remember, protect the peace of your own home, because peace isn't something you beg for. It's something you build, one honest, uncomfortable boundary at a time.